I think the way in which Indian fascism works in the contemporary conjuncture requires us to shift the frames of reference, right? And to also probably try and move beyond the usual registers through which fascist operations of power have been understood, right? So as constantly relying on a certain punitive rationality, right? So a certain kind of punitive disciplining of otherness, and which is why one of the structural ramparts of fascism has been the carceral state. I believe that there is a need in the contemporary conjuncture to move beyond logics of carcerality into logics of custodiality. And when I say custody, I mean a certain demand from the subject, from the citizen subject, right, so of an attitude of preemptive surrender, right, so where I come to the state, right, so with a preemptive attitude of surrender and resignation, where in return for my surrender the state will grant me protection. Yeah. So there is a certain kind of a prostrate subjectivity, right, so that the logic of custody works with, right, so that you are always permanently in custody, in the custody of the state. And that, I think, redefines the logic of fascism, right, so as opposed to acts of criminality, which then, or perceived acts of criminality, which then call forth the kind of totalitarian excesses of carceral. I'll give two short examples. The first is, of course, very recently, right, so last year in 2024, there was a recodification of the legal codes, right, so of the penal codes in India that happened. And what was earlier the Criminal Procedure Code has now been renamed as the Bharatiya Nagrik Suraksha Samhita, right, so which basically translates into the Indian Citizen Security Code, right? So where what has happened is, right, so the shift of penality from criminality, from questions of criminality to questions of citizen security. So you will, in order for you to be granted custody by the state, number one, you have to establish citizenship, right? And number two, you will have to first mark yourself as the other to the criminal subject. So criminality is no longer a question, right? So because non-citizens are by default defined as criminals, right? And therefore the presumption of law, right? So law will take effect only when you establish the claim to citizenship. And we know that all of this is related to the Citizenship Amendment Act in India, which has tried redefining the very basis of citizenship as exempting Muslim persons in India today, right? So which happened in 2019. Now, which is what ties to the immediate moment in India, right? So where on the 22nd of April there was an act of terrorist violence that happened in Kashmir, right? So where 26 tourists were killed, right? So by armed gunmen, right? So, and the immediate response that happened to this specter of armed terrorist violence was that Kashmiri students across Indian universities in mainland India were immediately targeted, right? So, and we are constantly getting reports of Kashmiri students being threatened in public, right? So of them being threatened with public lynching, of them being thrown out of their rented accommodations, of them being persecuted by, let's say, public service vendors. So there is a wholesale kind of sentimental hate-mongering, right? So a kind of national campaign of hate-mongering that has become the immediate response to an act of terrorist violence in a border state of Kashmir. So which again goes to prove that now you do not really need the sanction of the state, right, so of the fascist state to go out and engage in hate crimes. Hate has become common sense, right? So the only way in which you belong to the state, right, so is by kind of miming the language of hate, right? So, and the Kashmiri students become the easiest prey or the easiest targets of it, right? So for all this while we have been seeing that university students in general were the threat to the fascist state, and now within the university students again as a group, right? So the worst and the most vulnerable, right, so constituency would be Kashmiri students. So all bile can be just easily directed at them, and that becomes I believe that exactly is the secret of custodiality, right? So where in being in permanent custody, right, so of the state, you activate a certain kind of common sense that does not require any ideology anymore, that do not require a training into state ideology. I mean, the state almost absents itself, right? So insofar as hate becomes, right, so every citizen's prerogative, right? So, and any kind of response to the security threat that the state perceives or the state experiences, right? So any kind of threat to the state can then be avenged by citizens in the name of the state, right? So because the citizen is in permanent custody of the state, and that is the kind of commoning of hate that then works as. And so basically the function of hegemony, it has somehow just itself made itself redundant. I mean, as much as what is happening in India at this moment feels completely absurd, right? So in the sense that there is an act of apparent violence that's happened in a state which is most heavily militarized for decades now, right? So there are, I have to mention this, that there are 600,000 army personnel posted in the border state of Kashmir, right? So which claims to be ensuring the territorial integrity of the nation, and breaching that security cordon if there is one incident of terrorist violence that happens, then national common sense and the collective conscience of the nation gets mobilized in such a way that all Kashmiris everywhere are then a threat to the nation, and of them again, right? So the worst group, the worst affected group clearly would be the university students, and I think there is hope there, right? So insofar as Kashmiri university students become the immediate source of the threat, right? So means that there is something about the university. There is something about the Kashmiri entering, the Kashmiri subject entering the space of the public university that really feels like a threat to the custodial state. I mean, that is where the hope is, and that is therefore also where the potential danger and the threat to the fascist custodial state is, right? So I think what the state fears is that there is a potential training of the imagination that can happen at the university, right? So where the Kashmiri can eventually become just the university student and not the Kashmiri student, right? So, and that training of the imagination is what they want to foreclose. So I want to repose faith, right? So in the redemptive possibilities, right? So in this moment, right? So where, of course, on the one hand you have visceral hate, right? So becoming the national religion of the country, right? So becoming, let's say, a form of common sense that does not even require legitimation by state power. And on the other hand, you have the university, which still is constantly being localized as the immediate source of threat, and therefore Kashmiri students, in particular, studenthood, as it were, right, becomes the source of threat. So I think, I mean, it is the university, it is the space of education, it is the space that trains the imagination into thinking, believing otherwise, that really is the source and the potential for resistance.